Hello. So, welcome. Today we're going to talk about how to aggregate friends and influence pivots. I'm Issa Beacon. I'm a software engineer on the Tableau Prep Conductor team.
And I'm Stephen McDonald, a software engineer on the Tableau Prep Conductor team.
So a little bit about us. My educational background is in computer science, electrical engineering, and math. I started out as a development engineer working on the production and testing of RFID technologies. Since I've been at Tableau, I've worked on the data prep, the big data, and now the Tableau Prep team. And one silly thing about me, I like to relax by playing foosball, and I always thought I was pretty good at it. But my friends decided to help me see and understand how bad I was, and they created a viz, and it turns out I have no idea what I'm doing.
My background is in computer science. I worked for a handful of years, or for a handful of companies, doing full stack web development. Some of those companies are Amazon and Costco Travel. The other ones you probably haven't heard of. I've been at Tableau for 3 years. All 3 years I've been working with Issa, same teams. And in my spare time, I like to backpack, I like to rock climb, and I really like doing both at the same time. But in this picture, I'm clearly doing neither of them.
So this talk is partially about aggregating friends. One way to aggregate friends is to be a dog person. So we have my very handsome Riggins on the left side.
And the clearly cuter Sai on the right side.
Cool. So this presentation is kind of in the format of a 1930s self-help seminar, how to win friends and influence people. So we'll do kind of like a clever starter slide on that. Then we'll go over Tableau Prep for those of you who haven't seen it. Stephen will cover how to aggregate friends, and I will introduce you to influencing pivots, and we'll wrap up for questions. Cool. So 6 things this presentation will do for you. I don't know if it will do all of these, but it will definitely increase your popularity, so look out for that. But really what this talk will do is to demystify the operation of performing aggregations and pivots by showing you the new approach we take with Tableau Prep. Cool. So what is Tableau Prep? See, where Tableau has been around helping people see and understand their data, there's kind of some unspoken friction where if your data is spread out, formatted differently, or contains inconsistencies, you could have some problems. So with Tableau Prep, we help you verify the state of your data at any step, and also kind of abstract the pain of cleaning your data away from the analysis so you can stay in your flow once you get going.
I'm sure there are some in this room whose only experience with Tableau Prep thus far was yesterday at the Vision keynote. There's a talk tomorrow that is going specifically about telling you how to use Prep, what it's used for. That talk is called Preparing Your Data, the Tableau Prep Way, and it's at 12:30. Also, you can come down to the labs to talk to some Tableau Prep engineers that can help you learn some basics on Prep, that can help answer some questions, and you can get your hands dirty with the product yourself. But that advice doesn't really help us right now, so I'm going to orient us with the product real quick. This is not going to be a definitive guide. I just want to make sure that we have the same language we can use to communicate about the UI when we're showing you how to do aggregations and pivots. There we go. All right. This is the Tableau Prep homepage. Looking on the right side over here is the Discover pane. This is where you can find training videos, as well as blog posts and some deeper documentation that can teach you the basics of Prep, or even teach you how to get the most out of the features of Prep you already know how to use. Here in the center is a list of your most recently used flows. A flow is to Prep what a workbook is to desktop. A flow is where the work gets done. And down the bottom, we have a couple of sample flows intended to help stir your creativity when using Tableau Prep. So let's open up the SuperSOAR sample flow. What we're looking at here is the flow pane. The flow pane is a map of all of the work that is being done to our data flowing from left to right. There are different shapes for steps on the flow, and the shape that is just the single colored bar with some icons on top of it, that's a container step. And a general rule of thumb that isn't always true is the container step is going to hold most of your cleaning operations, whereas these other steps that have different icons are more for larger transformative operations that kind of change the structure of your data. So I'm highlighting right now a union step. This is a join step. If we get over to the right side here, we can see a pivot step, an aggregation step, and this is an output step where we are going to output our newly cleaned and transformed data to either a hyper extract, a TDE extract, or a CSV file with the intention of later consumption in Tableau desktop or some other application of your choice. And these on the far left, these are input steps. That's bringing data into the party. The last thing I want to show here on the UI is by selecting any of the steps in the flow, it's going to highlight the step in the flow and then bring up the other panes in the Tableau Prep interface. On the bottom, we have a data grid, which is showing what the actual values of the rows look like at the highlighted step. And above that is the profile pane. The profile pane shows you all of the columns in your data set in a histogram view. And when you select on any of the values in the histogram, it highlights the histograms of all the other columns, showing you the distribution of records in those columns that share that same value. Doing so also updates the data grid below. Oops, wrong button. And one last thing, even though I already said one last thing. On the left side here is the connections pane. And in the connections pane, you can see all of the connections that the flow has currently. And in this one, we have 3 Excel connections and 3 text connections. You can click the plus icon anytime you're in the flow to add new connections to this party. And this list of connections is almost the same list as what's in desktop. There's some in here that desktop doesn't have and some that desktop has that we don't have here, but it's constantly being updated. So when you're working with prep, if you're looking for a connection that's not there, chances are it's on the way. Now, let's talk aggregations. I cannot think of a better way to start this talk than with an unintelligible single-sentence definition. Aggregation, the gathering of data expressed in summary form, resulting in increased clarity through the raising of the level of detail. As with most definitions, this requires some unpacking to make sense of it. But don't worry, I'm not going to sit here for 20 minutes boring us all to teeth and nails, which is not the saying, but I forgot the saying just now, with me just trying to explain to you the meaning behind this definition that I completely made up a couple weeks ago. I instead want to take a more practical approach. I want us to talk about what the effects of an aggregation are and how we make use of them. To get us started, I'm going to introduce an overly simplified sales table. We have 4 columns in the sales table: the region the sale was made in, the seller who brokered the sale, the transaction ID of the sale, and the amount the sale was for. Each row in this table represents a single transaction. So we would say this table is at the transaction level of detail. And if the term level of detail just filled your head with static, as it did mine for over 2 years at Tableau, there is a talk tomorrow specifically about level of detail called LODs of Fun with Level of Detail Calculations. That talk is at 3:30. If you can't make the talk, or if you just want to have a moderate amount of fun, then you can find an overwhelming amount of resources online that talk about level of detail conceptually, as well as level of detail calculations specifically. But for this talk, you can think of the level of detail as the granularity of the data. If you answer the question, what does a single row in this data represent? Then you have the level of detail. And in the context we're talking about it, I think that should be clear enough. Back to our table. Since this table is at the level of detail of transaction, it's very easy to answer any questions related to a specific transaction. So if Isa asked me about transaction 3, I could easily tell him Suzanne brokered it, it happened in the South, and it was $400. The data is just sitting there on the table, right? But if Isa wants to know what the total amount of sales were for the South region, it's not as straightforward. To help us answer questions related to the region level of detail, we're going to first aggregate this table to match the region's level of detail. And this, on the right, is what the aggregation looks like. During the aggregation, we grouped the rows at the level of region. During our grouping, we used the count distinct function on the seller column, which tells us the distinct number of sellers who brokered a sale for a given region. We used the count function on the transaction ID column, telling us the number of transactions we made for a given region, and we used the summation function on the amount column, telling us the total amount of sales we had for each region. A single row in this aggregated table represents all the data related to a single region. We can say that the aggregated table is at the region level of detail. Now the question of how many sales did we make in the South region is straightforward, because it's just sitting in the table. There are 3 effects that this aggregation had on our data that I want us to make note of. We summarized the records for each of the groups. We reduced the data volume from 11 rows to 4. And we changed the level of detail from that of transaction to that of the region. When you desire one or more of these effects on your data, or when you notice one or more of these effects on your data, then you should be thinking about aggregations. As simply as I could describe it, that was what an aggregation does. Before we continue, I have some great news. You're not going to believe it. Hypothetically, Isa and I own a hypothetical company that hypothetically sells books. And we're letting all of you in on the ground floor. Congratulations, you are all equal partners now.
Oh, man.
Here's a table from a hypothetical transactional database of our hypothetical company. This table is at the transaction level of detail. We can say that because each row of the table represents all the data for a single transaction. There's a transaction ID column, the date of the sale, title, author, and ISBN of the book sold, list price, discount applied to the sale as a decimal, and then the sale price. Also, confusingly, what I just referred to as list price is actually just labeled price, so we'll work through that as a group. We had a good month, and we sold out of most of our inventory, so we have to restock. And Isa had a great idea. We should restock with books from authors that gave us the most income last month, right? So I created a viz to show us just that. I first put author on the columns, giving us a list of all of the authors from whom we have sold a book. Then I put sale price under rows. Note how the pill says sum of sale price. Sale price is a measure, so Tableau automatically aggregated the value for me. And the default aggregation function for numeric measures is sum. The result is the total amount of sales aggregated to the level of author. And we can now easily see which authors to purchase new books from. The next question we have to answer is how many copies of these best-selling authors' books do we need to purchase? To help answer that in a visual way, I put transaction ID onto color. But transaction ID is a dimension, so Tableau didn't automatically aggregate it for me. Instead, it altered the level of detail of the viz. In doing so, it broke down each of the author's bars into multiple smaller bars, each of which representing the sales for a single transaction. And now the cumulative height of each of those bars represents the total sales for a given author. Although this viz is quite pretty, it isn't useful for answering our question. What I wanted to do was to aggregate transaction ID to the level of author. By right-clicking on the transaction ID pill, I navigated to measure, then selected the aggregation function I wanted applied. In this case, I wanted to count the total number of copies sold of each book, so I used the count function. And now the transaction ID field is aggregated to the level of detail of author. Here it's represented as color, and the color gradient shows us the number of books sold for each author, a darker color indicating more books. The point of this simple example was to show that for nearly every viz you create in Tableau, under the covers an aggregation is being computed. These aggregations are useful at the time of analysis for sure, but they're also useful at other parts of our data's journey as well. However, in Tableau Desktop, no matter how complicated we make our data source pane, the only time we can execute any aggregations in a visual and direct way, the Tableau way, is in the viz at the time of analysis. There are times when straightforward analysis, and indeed sometimes when any useful analysis at all, requires some data sources to be aggregated prior to a join or a union with other data sources. And up until recently, that was only possible with complicated ETL processes or custom SQL. Tableau Desktop just isn't the right tool for the job. Let's see how Prep unleashes new aggregation potential as we continue to restock our company. I have an idea. I think to help us with our analysis, we should use this data set I found. It has a bunch of information about book reviews that I think when combined with our book sales data is useful information. So let's connect to our book sales data here in Tableau Prep. The plus icon, select the text file connection, and we'll grab the book sales data. What you're looking at here is the custom experience for the input step, and I'm just going to skip past it. That's not what this talk is about, unfortunately. But let's add another file, our book sale, or the book reviews data. Here on the right side of the input step, we can see all of the fields that are present in the data source we just added. In this one, we can see we have information about the book. So we've got the title and author. Those are good. Those are useful. But here's a book ID column that is some arbitrary number, more than likely used by the website to identify each book individually. If it were the ISBN, then that might be a useful value, but this arbitrary number means nothing to us. So I'm going to deselect it to remove it from our data source. There's also information about the reviewer who gave the book reviews. So we've got the reviewer's name, reviewer ratings, and reviews count. And none of those are useful to us either. I don't really care about the reviewers who gave the books. I just care about the score. So let's get rid of those. And what we're left with is information about the review. The review itself as just a string. We've got the ratings count, which is the number of times a book has been reviewed. And then the most important piece of data for our analysis is the ratings field. It's a numeric value with possible ranges between 0 and 5, an indication of the score the reviewer gave the book. So to combine these, we're going to end up doing a join. And we could do that right now quite simply by clicking and dragging our book reviews step over the book sales step and releasing onto the join dropbox that appears. And this is the custom join experience that I'm also going to blow past because it would take, I've practiced it. It takes a long time to talk through all of this stuff. What I am going to do, though, is update the join clauses from just title to being the combination of title and author. And now I'm going to add an empty step and minimize our connection pane. So now we can see what the result of our join looks like. This is exactly what the data would look like were we to execute this join in Tableau Desktop. And when we look at the data source pane down here at the bottom, I see something alarming. For every book, which we identify as the combination of title and author, there are a lot of records. And just scrolling through this, you can see that the vast majority of all the data in this data set is duplicated. If these were larger data sets, if this was running on some of our server infrastructure, this could overwhelm our feeble infrastructure with giving us no value. It's just duplicated data. It doesn't add anything to our analysis. But the one thing that's the most alarming for our purposes in restocking our book company is right here. This numeric rating field. For each book, that value is duplicated. And being a numeric field, it's going to be aggregated when we put it into Tableau Desktop. So if some future analyst were to take this data set we're creating and drop rating out onto the viz, it would sum the values, and it would be some ridiculously large number that is only ridiculous because we happen to know that value should only be between 0 and 5. So that's institutional knowledge that we would have to share with every person who uses this later. It's a fragile system, and it's sloppy. So why do we have all this duplication in the first place? Let's figure that out real quick. Let's look at our book sales data again. And as we explained before, this is in the transaction ID level of detail. So every record here represents a single transaction. And since we had a good month, we've sold all of our books multiple times. But the book reviews data that I brought in is at the book level of detail. It's at the level of detail of the combination of title and author. So every row represents a book. So when we joined them, all of this information for a single book had to be duplicated for every transaction of that one book. What we need to do is get into the same level of detail before we join them. And I think you probably know where we're going. We're going to use an aggregation. To add an aggregation to our book sales data, click the plus icon in the flow pane, add aggregate. And now we're looking at the custom experience for the aggregation step. On our left side, we have the list of all of the fields in our data set. We have the data type of the field that we can change right here, and the default aggregation function applied to the field. Were we to have a larger data set here, a wider table, hundreds of columns, then a simple search in the search bar allows us to identify our fields easily. The way that I like to handle aggregations is first identify the desired level of detail of the aggregated data. We've done that already, title and author. So I'm going to grab title into the grouped fields pane right here, this pane that is labeled grouped fields, and I'm going to bring author out as well. And you can see that for those two columns, we got a data grid and a profile pane. Now the next step is to find all of the fields that we want aggregated to those levels, and we're going to bring them to the aggregated fields pane on the right side. Start with sale price, and its default aggregation function of sum is a good one. Now we can see the total amount of money that we've earned for a given book. We have the discount that I think is useful for our analysis. Maybe there are some books that we have to heavily discount to get them off our shelves. But the sum default aggregation here is not what we want, I think. Average makes more sense to me, because now we can see the average discount applied to a given book. Another piece of information I really want us to have for our analysis is the number of copies sold for each of our books. And there's a number of ways that this could be done, but it happens to be such a common operation for aggregations that we at Prep built a feature specifically designed for it. If we look at our list of fields, there's a field there that wasn't in our original data set. It's supposed to be a little easier to find being italicized, but you can see it here as number of rows aggregated. When this is brought out into the aggregated fields pane and released, the default aggregation function of sum is applied, and the number that comes out is the number of rows that were aggregated that now make up the values of the row that it's sitting on. In our case, this is the number of copies sold for each of our books. In the aggregation step, any of the fields on this left pane that aren't included in either the grouped or the aggregated fields pane are removed from our data set, because we didn't tell prep what to do to aggregate those fields. But I definitely want to make sure we have listed price, incorrectly labeled as price, in our aggregated data, but sum doesn't make sense there. And trying to think about which one to use, that field is the same value for every record in our sales table, because we only list a book at one price. So we could use average, because the average of 12 versions of any number is just that number. But I happen to know that minimum and maximum are more performant aggregation functions. So I'll just pick minimum. OK. I think we should try our join again. Once again, a click and drag, and then release. And once again, blowing past all of these juicy details. Another empty step. And almost like I planned it and manipulated the data to make it so, the resulting table has a single record per book. And most importantly, our rating field has no duplication. This data is now ready for analysis in Tableau Desktop. Let's quickly review what we've learned so far before passing control over to Isa. We learned that my dog is cuter, but that I make poor quotes. We learned what the effects of aggregations are and how to utilize them. We learned that Tableau Desktop is an aggregating machine, but only at the time of analysis. And we learned how Tableau Prep unleashes new aggregation potential, allowing us to visually and directly aggregate when, where, and how we want to. Isa is now going to teach us about pivots.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. All right. Let's close out of this. So we're going to start out by looking at an example I made. Awesome. These are the sales for the bookstore that we just created by region and by year. So you can see along the top, the number of sales over time is 2015 through 2018, and then on the left side, the different region of the country. And for this data set, it's pretty easy to see how I did for like a single year. So let's say 2015, I wanted to see how did I do by region. So I just, in Tableau, I would drag the 2015 column out. Maybe I'd have a scatter plot. Maybe I'd have a bar graph. And we can kind of get an idea of how we did, I guess. But what if we wanted to see kind of over time? Maybe I'd drag the remainder of the years out. And Tableau doesn't really know that these fields are related. So it kind of treats them as separate vises. The bar graph you can kind of make sense of, but the scatter plot doesn't really have any connection between the points, so it's still not great. It turns out that the best way to make this data accessible is to perform a pivot, which will essentially bring the data contained in my column headers down into my rows. For this talk, performing a pivot refers to the action of transforming column data to rows. So to help us understand this transformation, I'm going to show you an animation of what happens to the data when you pivot. To be clear, this isn't part of Tableau Prep, it's just for illustration purposes, and it's not planned to be included in the product. In the first format, we have the same year information contained in the headers of each column, and then after pivoting, we'll find that the year information that was in the headers is now in a pivot name column, and the sales numbers that had been reproduced in another column called pivot values. The regions have been mapped to each newly created row, so no data is lost. Let's see if this animation works. So I'm going to select my years, drag it into the pivot area, and the data transforms from from columns to rows. Cool. Now, if I drag these fields into Tableau in the same manner, we can easily see over time that sales in the south have been kind of stagnant, but sales in the west have been awesome. Stephen's not the only one who can create quotes. I wrote this one. Pivot by any other name would be functionally equivalent. So for as common as it is, there isn't one standardized name for performing a pivot. What Tableau calls a pivot, others refer to as a fold, a melt, a gather, or even an unpivot. So just watch out. Just columns to rows. So how do you perform a pivot, a fold, a melt, a gather, or an unpivot? Just a few steps. You identify which columns you want to pivot. So in our sales example, it was the sales years. You select these columns and then perform the pivot. And then afterwards, you're going to be left with two new fields, the pivot names, which would be years, and the pivot values, which would be sales in our example. And then you can clean up any nulls, which doesn't really happen in the simple pivot case, but does happen in more complicated coordinated pivot cases, which we'll talk about in a sec. And then change data types as necessary. So Tableau pivots. In Tableau, pivoting is as simple as going to the data pane, selecting the fields that you want to pivot, right-clicking and pivoting. You also have the option of writing some tricky custom SQL if you're into that kind of thing. I can write SQL, but I'm not good at it, so I'd prefer to let Tableau do all the driving. Some things to be aware of. Yep, Tableau allows pivoting, and it also allows it with custom SQL. You have to perform pivots before you actually work with your data, so you can't really write any calculated fields and then go and pivot. You can only do one pivot per data source and no coordinated pivot cases unless you feel like digging into custom SQL. So let's take a look at how Tableau Prep does it. So I pulled up some data from my own life here. I love watching Netflix. I watch a lot, and I feel kind of terrible watching so much Netflix. So I also like to read. And I feel like if I balanced how much time I spent like binging on Netflix with how much time I spent reading, if that was roughly equal, I'd be okay. So here's my data, broken down by the last few months. I have the different categories of stuff, like I watch science fiction, just by the last few months. And we're going to pull this data into Tableau Prep and see if we can't figure out whether or not my books versus binges numbers are balanced. So here we are on the home screen, and we're going to connect to my data. And I can see on this slide that these look like the fields I need. I don't need to exclude anything like Stephen did because I need all this data. Maybe I'll add a step just to see, yeah, this looks pretty good. If I wanted to, I can brush and see, here's the different numbers for programming shows versus books. And let's perform a pivot. So this is the pivot step in Tableau Prep. On the left-hand side, I have all the fields that I want to work with from my data source. And then the pivot area where I'll drag the fields, and then the result. So I'm going to start by, you can add fields to a pivot by just double-clicking on them, but there's a lot of fields, so it'd kind of be better if I could just search for, let's say, the read hours, select them all, and drag them in. One cool thing about Tableau Prep pivots are that if we recognize a common string in your column headers, we'll rename the pivot value field to the common string we detect. That's pretty useful in this case, and it actually got it right, but sometimes it might not. If it's not the result that you're looking for, you can just disable it here. Cool. So I got all the read fields, and now I want to get all those Netflix hours. So I'll type that in, and then drag the fields in. Cool. So now I have all my reading hours, all my watching hours. Let's see what the end result looks like in a new step. So it looks like I did a pretty good job pivoting. If I wanted to dive in, I could see how many hours I read in August for programming, but I kind of want my data side by side. Is there a way to pivot in a slightly different way so that all the reading hours and all the Netflix hours were aligned on each row? Let's find out. So I'm going to try creating a pivot again. And I'm going to add the read hours again. And it correctly gets the name. But this time, I'm going to click this plus button, which will initiate a coordinated pivot. Now, I'm going to search for my Netflix hours, select them, and drag them into the coordinated pivot grouping. And as you can see, Smart Pivot correctly recognized that these are watch values, and it also correctly aligned each field that I want to group. Cool. Now when I look at a step, it's easy for me to see the relationship between the two different groups. I'm going to rename this field month/year. And now I can kind of dive in and check out for the month of July. Looks like I watched 24 hours of Black Mirror, but I still read 18 hours of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Awesome. Looks like there's also some null values in my data. If I look at those, it looks like for programming, I don't have any data yet, which is probably because I've been preparing for this talk. Cool. Tableau Prep makes the act of performing pivots pretty simple and allows you to be confident in the resulting format of your data. Now that I've covered a specific example, let's go through some more general scenarios where Tableau Prep shines. So let's say I needed to clean up a few field names, aggregate on some other fields, create a calculated field and filter on it, and then join on that filtered field, and then pivot. What might be tricky in Tableau is simple in Tableau Prep. I open my file, I perform these filters and calculations, I also aggregate, and then I join the two, and then I pivot. Awesome. What if I have a billion fields in my data source? So let's say these are the fields in my data source, and I have 12 fields that start with month names, 4 fields that start with symbols, 6 name category fields of movies, 1 field that contains Latin, and I don't even speak Latin, and then 8 fields that I actually want to pivot on, all in reverse alphabetical order. What do? In Tableau, you might have to hunt and peck through the entire list of data source fields. In Tableau Prep, you can just search for it, or you can provide a regular expression and then find all your fields and drag them to the pivot. What if I needed to pivot on one set of fields, filter out some data I don't need, and then pivot on another set? Tableau Prep is awesome. So here I open a file, I pivot, I filter out a robot user, and then I pivot on a separate set of fields. Awesome. Similar to the example I showed with Netflix, what if I needed to, I had one group of fields that correlated to sales and another that correlated to inventory, and I wanted to pivot and align them at the same time. Awesome. So just like I showed you, you'd create a second group and then add that to the second pivot group. So to review, in Tableau Prep, you can insert a pivot step anywhere you need. You can quickly search for related fields. There's also this functionality called wildcard pivoting where let's say you're constantly adding new data sources or new fields to your data source. So let's say every quarter you just add one new field. You can specify a wildcard term, and then in the future, when that new field is added, as long as it matches the expression, it will automatically be pulled in next time your flow is run. You can add as many pivot nodes as you need, coordinate your pivots across related fields, and also unpivot from rows to columns. And if you're interested in that, there's another talk, which we'll review at the end, that you can go to. And some gotchas, so just know when to pivot. It can be challenging to recognize the right time to pivot. One thing I like to key off of when I'm exploring my data is just if I'm kind of eyeballing the column headers and I'm like, oh, that would be really useful to have in my analysis, that's a good time to try out a pivot. There can be null values, which are easy to find using Tableau Prep since we give you that profile pane with the histogram and also the data grid, so you can quickly be like, oh, hey, I wonder why that's there, and just reconcile it. Chaining 2 pivot steps, just from my own experience, isn't very common, so I had to kind of really stretch to come up with a scenario where you had multiple pivots. Usually what you want is a coordinated pivot where the data is aligned. So if you're in doubt, maybe try out a coordinated pivot and then 2 separate pivot steps if you need to. And then smart pivot naming isn't always perfect, and if it doesn't work out for you, you can just unselect it like I showed. Cool. So now you're all excited to try out Tableau Prep. There's a few ways you can do that. Check out the Tableau Prep blog post on the Tableau blog. The latest prep version we have out right now is 2018.3.1, and you can go out to tableau.com to try it out, or find us at the data kiosk in the data village in the expo hall, and we have demos and people who can go through everything Tableau Prep. And please complete the session survey in the app too. We love your data and we love hearing how cute our dogs are. So please check that out. And here are those sessions. The first one is a general guide to Tableau Prep. These are all tomorrow. The second one is actually the talk where they talk about transforming, pivoting from columns to rows. Rows to columns. And the last one is the talk Stephen was talking about.
LODs of fun with level of detail calculations. I have no weight on that. I just like the title very well.
Oh, yes. Cool. And now we'll open it up to questions. This one? No.
No, back at like your second or third slide.
Okay. It's going to be a lot of animation. Yes.
Yeah, now that we've been through it, I wanted to just kind of come back and
Yeah, and I think these slides are going to be posted somewhere where you can access them.
Yeah,
Cool.
and these are the restrictions that Tableau Desktop has for pivots.
Yeah, the question was, we just,
Not in Prep.
no, yeah,
Not in Prep.
prep is awesome.
We had to make the case for Prep
Yeah.
real quick.
Will the changes we make in something like a Tableau Prep be writable up to Oracle or MySQL?
So currently, the only outputs are to Hyper, TDE, and CSVs. And us engineers are itching to try to get right database, but we have no idea if and when that will come.
Yeah, if you visit us in the data village, we'd love to hear any suggestions and input you have. But yeah.
That one.
We're with you.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot that we want to add that just, limited personnel hours and such.
I stepped in a little late, so you might have covered this, but can you extract your data from Tableau Prep into an Excel format or some other format so that you're actually providing a clean data set if somebody else wants the underlying data for any reason, or you want to upload it to another source?
Yeah, so the 3 formats we currently support are to a Hyper or TDE extract, or you can go out to a CSV file. And when I was trying to align my data sets for my example, I used Prep and output it out to CSV.
One cool thing that I forgot to kind of cover is that you can also at any point in Tableau Prep right-click on a node and click Preview in Tableau. And I mean, it's not exactly related to your question, but it will open your current state of your data at that step node in Tableau in case you want to explore it. So that's pretty cool. I like that.
What's a coordinated pivot again versus the chained?
Right. So I I really don't like diving into the chain pivot example because it's so confusing to me. But a coordinated pivot is when you have 2 groups of fields and you want to pivot them both. So I have like months of data for sales and months of data for inventory. So like dollar sales numbers and actual inventory numbers. And I want to pivot them both. So I have like all the months, August through September, but a bunch of months. And then I have one column for all the inventory numbers for that month, and then one column for all the sales numbers. So you have 2 groups. If you just pivoted just inventory and sales in one pivot, you wouldn't be able to see the 2 numbers side by side. Coordinated pivots are for seeing the numbers, like the groups side by side, if that makes any sense. Or
So,
I can show you.
Yeah, his example he gave was a coordinated pivot, and you can see that the months, August of 18, July, June, they line up with each other. And if this were just to be first pivot the reads and then pivot the watches, they wouldn't line up. So the coordinated pivot allows you to take multiple of those columns and make sure that you're actually getting this month-year value is the same for all of the records that have been pivoted.
Thank you.
I have a question about automatically adding new fields to a pivot. You said you could use a wildcard option. Is there any way to do that with a date? Can you use the data type versus if the date contains, a period or
So a really good
/
question.
something like that.
Unfortunately, I don't actually have any answer there because wildcard pivot isn't in 2018.3.1, but it is coming in sometime next year, and I haven't played with the feature myself.
And there is some interesting date stuff that is coming up. I wish I could talk more. If you actually come afterwards, there is someone in this room who worked on that exact thing that might be able to help you. Yep, thank you.
Hey, another question on coordinated pivots. Is there a limit as to how many you can add? I know in desktop you can only do it once, and I see an example here with 2, but can you have 12 if you have, if you're doing a monthly forecast or?
Sure. It's just performance starts to lag. So I've definitely coordinated a lot of pivots. You can definitely add more than just 2. It's just interesting as you get into the higher numbers. That's all I'll say.
So no limit, but
No
it
limit.
could
Yeah, no limit.
just make,
The theoretical limit of the
Yeah.
performance of your hardware.
And now, an aggregation question for Steven.
Not that I know of.
Oh, you mean just Tableau, not Tableau Prep?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Tableau does have there's a search bar now in the versions we have.
So maybe.
But yeah. I think it's already out. We can explore our data if you head up here afterwards.
For this coordinated pivot, for the coordinated pivot, does the naming convention of the columns matter? It just seems like they're all, August 18 matches August 18 matches August 18.
Let's kind of take off this. I guess, what do you mean?
So it doesn't matter as far as making the pivot function, but it is really common that whenever you're going to have something like this, the columns tell you what the data is. For the automatic naming to work, it's not super verbose. We're not doing some big machine learning stuff to try to just pick out the names. So if you don't have something that kind of works with the regular expressions we've set up, then it just won't work. But as you can see in this case, right, the names all make sense and the naming worked out.
Yeah, I did cherry pick the names for the column headers. I put the month names, I think, at the beginning, and I had I think the first time I tried to go through this talk, I just had only numbers 8/18 or something, and it didn't quite work out. So it's a pretty basic regular expression pattern match thing going on, but it's easy to turn off.
If
so.
we get more feedback that it needs to be improved, then
Please,
we can
yes.
definitely do that.
So if you had split the date from the read or the watch, it created another field so that all the dates are in one field and the read watch in another field. Is that the same impact as the coordinated pivot?
So if I did a chain pivot and then?
No, just do a split. Yeah, you do a left or a right and then put the dates in one column and then put the month or the read in another column.
Yeah,
That way
so
you don't have two types of data in the same column. Then is that the same effect as doing a coordinated pivot?
So are you asking about doing a split on June 18 read, June 18 watch? So then I have.
So you have one column that has
Yeah.
your June 18, and then you've got a second column that has the read and the watch. So he's wanting to do that and then pivot so that your read and watch. So he's saying he's asking if it's the same equivalent of what you're doing with the coordinated pivot, which it is.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, that's what I would have.
Thank you. No, more
That's a very good
questions
question.
that can be answered in the crowd.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, that's what I would have done
Yeah.
if I didn't know about this coordinated pivot.
Yeah, it's entirely possible.
What you would have to do though is split on all of the
Yeah.
fields in this data set, which could be 100 if you have been collecting monthly data, right?
Yeah, this isn't actually my data. I got tired after a few months, so I've seen large data sets, and so if you're splitting on every one of those, it seems tedious. But it sounds like it could be possible, and I'm definitely going to try it out afterwards.
You talked a little bit about if more columns are added, then essentially you can set up the wildcard. Is there a piece of, and this might be more Tableau Prep than it is pivoting, but is there a way to set up then automation with Tableau Prep as far as just having it run looking for new columns if it is tied to a data source?
So the product that you are interested in, the product that would achieve that is Tableau Prep Conductor. It's the server version of Tableau Prep that we just launched the beta for here at TC. Tableau Prep Conductor allows all of the flows that you have uploaded to Tableau Server to run. You can set schedules to run them. And whenever they run, they'll grab any new data that is existing in those data sources.
Then, and this might be another an extension of that, but if we are a Tableau OEM client, so essentially our data warehouse vendor provides us with the Tableau licenses. Do you know if that's something that would fit within their licensing of that, so we can use it as their client, but yet they can still operate within the parameters that you guys set on their licenses?
Yeah, you're going to have to talk to your account holder. We don't know licensing
Sounds
stuff,
good.
unfortunately.
I figured it was.
Yeah, sorry.
Any other questions?
At the keynote, they were discussing automating Tableau online. Will that also be possible for Tableau Prep? So as data comes in, maybe in a small format or a long format, that it automatically runs Tableau Prep, which runs into the Tableau online, which feeds your dashboards.
So I don't actually know. It sounds like it would be a great feature that I will actually be taking back. Since we both work on Conductor, we're kind of trying to acquire new features. I don't actually know. I don't know what, how the licensing for Prep online will be, and I don't know what the limitations of that scheduling on data changes type of a thing would be. But it sounds like a really good feature.
Yeah, I think that Prep is just going to become a necessary step for all of us to really just get our data into Tableau.
That's our hope.
Yeah.
It already is for me.
Any other questions? All right. If any other questions strike you between now and sometime in the future,
Oh, they can't see it.
here are email addresses. You can feel free to email us. We'll make sure you get a response.
Cool. Thank you.